Shortcuts, aren't they fantastic? They make life easier. At least that is what we want to think. However, I'm sure you have heard the famous quote, "There's no shortcut to success." That is true. You have got to work hard in order to get what you want in life. What if I told you though that the brain makes the big mistake of taking shortcuts? But how? I can see perfectly, and assuming that you do not have an unfortunate condition like blindness, you probably can see clearly as well, right? Wrong. The fact that we can get tricked by illusions so easily helps us realize that our brains, as advanced as they are, certainly do have room for improvement. Our brain needs to take shortcuts in order to see. If we were able to see things the way we should, the size of our brains would be much larger. It would even be larger than a helium-sized balloon. It makes sense then that our brains need to evolve in such a manner that they can process visual information very simply. A phone camera works to process an image using something called pixels. These pixels are very tiny blocks of different or similar colors that are grouped together in order to create the larger image of a picture. This is how our phone camera takes a photo, for example. And then, if we zoom in enough to a particular part of that picture, we can see that it becomes blurry. And the reason for that is there's specific blocks within that picture. Like over here you can see that there are specific blocks that are dark pink or yellow or light pink, right? Well, essentially, if you zoom that out enough into this tiny part of a huge picture, the picture as a whole looks clear. But if you zoom in enough, then you can see that it's actually blurry. The human brain works differently. Although this picture is actually not particularly representative of exactly how the brain uses images to construct a visual field, it is somewhat conveying the idea and showcasing the difference from this image, in that the brain groups things together. It looks at similar colors, similar sizes, and similar shapes, and uses that to convey to the occipital lobe, which is at the back of our brain, which actually conveys the differences within the picture, allowing us to form that final image that we see. In order to understand how the brain does this, let's take a look at the eye and its connection to the brain. If you recall, the brain transmits signals through neurons, and also it receives signals through neurons as well. So, at the back of the eye, at the back of each of your eyes, over here and over here, is a lining called retina. The retina is filled with a bunch of photoreceptors. Now, before you get confused, stay with me. Photoreceptors are special neurons that, if you remember what neurons are the building blocks of everything in our body, every part of our brain and nervous system within our body. So, everything in our body is made up of tiny building blocks called cells, and neurons are specific to the brain and the nervous system. Now, what neurons do in the eye is that they receive a signal in the form of light at the back of the eye from the retina, and these neurons, which are specific cells, they are triggered by the light, either by different colors of the light or different shades. Rods are specific types of neurons that are triggered by specifically white or black colors. Meanwhile, cones are sensitive to either red, green, or blue. Whether something is really light in color or really dark is conveyed by the rods, while the actual color that's depicted by that is conveyed by the cones. So anyway, the light enters, it triggers the retina, the photoreceptors, and through that, the photoreceptors transmit the signals they receive through electrical charges into this nerve called the optic nerve. And both of the eyes have optic nerves, and the optic nerves enter the brain. And they actually cross over in the special region here called the optic chiasm. The optic chiasm allows the visual field in each part to go to the opposite side of the brain. Therefore, the visual field actually conveys different parts of each eye. But anyway, let's move on. So, Essentially, the optic chiasm is where the crossover occurs in the signal, and then it goes to this orange region right here called the lateral geniculate nucleus, which further breaks down the signals, and that's because the lateral geniculate nucleus is split up into 6 different sections, and those sections each are made up of neurons, and those neurons further convey motion, depth, and brightness, and categorizing the light helps us further understand exactly what we are seeing. Finally, once we have processed the light based on color as well as shade, and then eventually motion, depth, and brightness, the signal goes to the occipital lobe, specifically the visual cortex, which is where the brain finally pieces that information together and helps us understand exactly what we see. So this essentially is how our brain actually conveys our information. But by way of categorizing our information into specific things like brightness or darkness or motion or depth or color, it's taking shortcuts, because the only way to understand whether this is a beanbag in front of us, or whether it's a bright light, or whether it's the sun, or whether it's something else, right? It can only do so by way of understanding what is around that object. If the things that we see around that object are darker, then we'll automatically perceive the object to be lighter than it is. For example, if we look at a light bulb in a dark room, the light bulb actually seems lighter than it would seem if it were in daylight. And that's because the stuff around that light bulb affects how we see that light bulb as well. And that is the big tragedy that our brain makes, because that is the huge shortcut that leads to magic and optical illusions working. Specifically, let's take a look at some optical illusions that utilize tricks like that in order to mess with our heads. So this is the first illusion. Well, I'm guessing that you see 2 squares in the middle surrounded by different sized circles. For most of us, at least for me, I think that this square is bigger than this one. And I'm sure you can see to some extent why I might be thinking that, right? This seems to be sort of tiny. Well, take a look at this. They're actually the same size if you noticed. Let's take a look at it again. Why does that happen? Well, quite simply, the circles around this square are smaller. Therefore, we automatically perceive this square to be larger in size than we would normally think this square would be, because it's surrounded by larger objects in general. So the environment, the context, which is what we call it, plays a huge role in helping us understand what we see. Now take a look at this. Make sure to stare at the red dot. Don't move your eyes away from it. Stare at it for some time. Alright, now stare at the same red dot in the dark light. Hopefully, you can see a shining light bulb, or at least some sort of reminiscence of that. But this illusion is called the glowing light bulb illusion. This is referred to as the opponent process theory, where the idea is that if one color is triggering our eyesight for so long, then over time that eye will no longer respond as significantly to that color as much, and so it will see the opposite color instead. And that's exactly what happened. We were seeing the black light bulb for so long that we constantly became used to it, and our eye became tired of seeing the black color, to the extent that over time that signal became weak. So the moment we saw a normal black screen, we saw the opposite color, which is the white, instead, and therefore we saw the glowing light bulb. Now this is our next illusion, and this one's very interesting. It plays on the similar idea. This is A, this is B. Most people, including myself, would say square A is darker than square B. But take a look at this. A and B are the same color. I want you to pause this video and take a moment to try to think why this might be. This is a famous illusion as well that was created by scientists to prove a point. And the point was that the squares around A are lighter. The squares around B are darker. If you remember what I told you earlier, when we see something surrounded by lighter objects, we tend to think of it as being darker. When we see, for example, a light bulb in a dark room, we then tend to think of that light bulb as being brighter than it would be in a lighter room. And that's why we see square A to be darker, because its environment, the surrounding context around it, is actually darker in color or lighter in color. Meanwhile, B is surrounded by darker blocks. Look at all of these gray, dark gray blocks around it, right? And therefore, we think of B to be lighter in color. And that's why our brain takes shortcuts by way of seeing how the environment helps us understand and differentiate the object in order to make out that it is actually there. Our brain is really cool, but as I'm sure you can tell, sometimes it messes with us. Thank you so much for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe this video and support our organization, The Brain Bunch, by visiting our website, thebrainbunch.com, and either donating or volunteering, or perhaps doing both. Tune in next time, we're going to be talking about touch and how that special sense connects to the brain. Thank you very much once again. See you next time.